when you look at sort of the emerging markets that you're dealing with for Salesforce, are there cases where regulation has actually been used in a way that's positive and is helping accelerate the transition?
Well, I don't think regulations are going to help transition from a technology perspective, right? But I think what you're going to see from a regulatory perspective, there's obviously a divergence in terms of what the rules should be when it comes to privacy and the data that's being collected and how it should be used. I wish I had a simple answer for you, but the reality is we're living in a world where it's evolving so fast, right? When you think about whether it's sensors or mobile devices, and I think regulators both in Europe, in the United States, and across the world are looking at this issue and trying to figure out how do they actually consistently apply this, because from a business perspective it becomes really hard as you have to deal with various regimes when it comes to whether it's data privacy or the regulatory framework.
Now that you've been in the for-profit sector, if you went back to government and had the power to change things, what would be your priority if you had that power? And the second part of it is, how would you deal with the high-tech talent crisis?
Sure. So on the first question, I would have probably worked a lot closer with Congress sooner, given the time it takes to advance legislation. And I would also have implemented across the entire government the quarterly cadence that Wall Street has in terms of quarterly earnings, apply that pressure to government performance.
And what about the talent crisis? Because even what you're doing in Haiti, I mean, infrastructure is just part of the battle. Obviously, when we talk about big data, the real challenge is analytics and asking the right questions, and there's a paucity of talent.
Yeah, I think one of the craziest things we do is when it comes to our immigration reform, right? In terms of educating some of the brightest people in this country and then kicking them out instead of stapling a green card. But at the same time, making sure that the investments we're making in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that we're really doubling down when it comes to our K through 12 system. And we're not doing that, right? We're not doing enough when it comes to the K through 12 system. And on the other end, we're also kicking out the brightest people who are basically going back to their home countries and setting up companies that would compete with us, or what's worse is draining the talent away from people who could be creating a more perfect union right here.
What are the concerns in terms of the questions that you get that don't have easy answers that you think we'll be talking about next year?
I think the number one question that I hear across the board, whether I'm in Japan or UK or here, is facing extinction, right? How do they make sure that...
this is the role, that the person in the office facing extinction?
No, the company or their organization, right? So how do you make sure you're not, the next Borders, but you're actually Amazon? How do you make sure, that you're not the next Blockbuster, but you're next? I think a lot of organizations, whether it's governments, right? Governments end up having natural monopolies, so they can afford to stay in business with poor practices. Whereas for the private sector customers that I talk to, they're all trying to figure out how do they reinvent themselves for the modern economy.
Salesforce displaced the CRMs of the world as an example of extinction. And what software do you think is next to be displaced by Salesforce, the cloud, or anyone else?
Well, I think one area we're seeing a complete reinvention in the industry is actually marketing, right? So if you look at the role of the CMO, they're used to looking at business from the old channels of television and newspapers. And print magazines, right? And so now the CMOs are trying to figure out, and a whole host of technology companies that play in that space who haven't been able to innovate and keep up. Well, how do you actually tap into 1 billion plus users on Facebook? And you look at the number of users on Twitter and LinkedIn. So I think that entire category is going to be fundamentally disrupted and reinvented in the coming months and years ahead.
And what are they missing? Because, one of the things when you talk to CMOs is they talk about it from their perspective, but yet the data they want is data from other parts of the company that aren't speaking to each other. So, for example, let's say you've got supply chain data. Do you enable them to look at that supply chain data so everybody's looking at the same dashboard and asking the same questions? Or is it just the people in the marketing department calling the CIO every 2 weeks and keeping them up to date?
Well, I think it's even bigger than that, right? I think it's more about how do you make sure that as a CMO, when you're thinking about your customers, that whether you're in a B2B business or you're in a B2C business, that you create a personalized experience. Because they expect it now, right? Just think about the number of times you walk into a hotel and you've been there for the 20th time and they don't even know who you are, right? And there are companies that are investing in technology where they're creating a very, very personalized experience, or they know, what you talked about. So
when you've started to appreciate the cultural nuances of how people are approaching this space, have you noticed anything that might be informative or?
So I'm going to close with an example of the IRS, actually. It was this very, very specific. What happened is, when I was in the White House, there was an issue we were noticing, which was student aid applications in terms of forms. And it was this really, really complicated form that had hundreds of questions. And a lot of kids who were applying for student aid would just stop, filling it out. And the reason was because they were asking the same questions for the IRS that they were for the Department of Education. And we basically said, well, how do we actually simplify this form so that we're not asking them, right? And so the answer was, well, we can't share the data because there are federal laws that prevent data sharing. And so it was a very simple technology solution which allowed the student to basically click and download the data from the IRS, essentially, eliminating over 70 questions and creating a much simpler citizen experience. And you can still have 2 sets of books. Exactly. So I feel like what we're going to see is technology is going to disrupt also that citizen experience while respecting the privacy and security of people. But when I look long-term, and what I mean by long-term is 5, 10, 15 years from now, what you're going to see is entire sectors of the economy that are being reinvented, whether it's healthcare or education, and the very notion of privacy or of a neighborhood is going to be very different. When I look at kids now, they have a very different notion of what a neighborhood is. It's a digital neighborhood. It's global in context. Versus when I was growing up, it was actually a physical construction, right? Where you had a literal neighborhood. I think that's going to push to the edges the understanding of whether it's privacy or security. And I don't think any country or union actually has an answer yet. I think what they're grappling with is as they go and explore privacy and security, what they're finding is that it's bleeding into various aspects of how they run their country or how companies operate or individuals run their own lives.